habit of saying things like, "Boss, I think we're being invaded," but that's about as close as you might get. These other documents are more of the same. They describe, many of them, utterly awesome violations of sensitive airspace by objects that, quite frankly, just are not supposed to have existed. Now, if you read a couple of these, you might think, okay, well, no big deal. Maybe a pilot got his bearings off, maybe had some kind of illusory experience up there. But when you read 15 or 20 or 50 or 100 of these, you got to wonder. And in particular, when you see the tone of these memos and then clearly they're taken seriously by military higher-ups. And then when you fail to see any kind of follow-up documentation, you got to wonder, as I do. Oh, here we go. The D.C. encounter, which I mentioned to you. I'm going to skip past that. Stevensville, Texas. I moved this a little. This happened this morning, guys. In fact, I put this in about 15 minutes before I took off to come here. I don't know what this is, but I will say that this has made mainstream websites. Spaceweather.com is absolutely mainstream, science-based website. This happened this morning in Norway over a period of many hundreds of miles. Apparently, thousands of people saw this. That's not photoshopped, apparently. There is a video of it, which you can go to spaceweather.com, and there's actual apparent video of this. I don't know what this thing is, and if it turns out to be a hoax, well, then I've just spent a minute describing a hoax, but right now it's getting some play, and that's bizarre. I don't know if that's a weapon test. Some people suggested it was a Russian rocket that spiraled or went out of control. It doesn't quite look like that. I don't know what that is. This morning in Norway. So go to spaceweather.com and you can look this up yourself. Now, there has been for as long in the modern era as we've had this phenomenon, there have been efforts by citizens of all countries, certainly in the United States, to end this secrecy. Look, we live in a country where we have a history of public sovereignty. We are supposed to be sovereigns of our country. Our government, in theory, is supposed to be responsible to us. And so if you've got this thing happening that some people think is important, the idea is, well, hell, the government's supposed to be responsible to me. Let's get some action on it, and enough with the secrecy. That's the idea of democratic, open, Republican types of governments. Great idea. So you've got a history of citizen groups trying to make that happen. Keep in mind, I have to remind myself this, the history of this cover-up now is nearly as old as the history of the old Soviet Union. Soviet Union lasted about 75 years. This cover-up's over 60. Long, long time. And let me just point out, I'm sure most or all of us remember back in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. I was a young student. I did a lot of Soviet studies at that time. It was very exciting. Here's a Soviet leader talking about glasnost and perestroika and its openness and restructuring. Wow, right? What happened? Well, 6 years later, there was no Soviet Union. It all cracked apart. This process of reform spiraled absolutely out of Gorbachev's control. It's one thing to talk about openness. It's another thing when people in Azerbaijan say, openness? Great. Well, we don't want to be in your country anymore. Or the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Latvia. We don't... Remember 1940? You took us over. We weren't too down with that. We'd like to be out. Gorbachev initially said, I didn't mean that. Well, a little late. When you start the process of a reform, after many, many decades and generations of repression and secrecy, you better watch out because you don't know what you're going to end up with. And really, I'm suggesting to you that we're in a very similar situation regarding UFO secrecy. A little bit of a history. I do want to make sure, I really want to make sure I don't go over here. So I've got my watch with my timer. Well, we all know that this whole thing kind of hit big time in the 1940s. We had a definite crisis in 1947. Lots of press coverage for a couple of weeks, from June into July, right after Roswell. It ended. The press coverage just went shh. From late June, where you get a fellow named Kenneth Arnold, who saw these objects over the state of Washington, that he described as discs, saucers skimming over the water. That's how he said they moved. We got the phrase flying saucers. The country got this mania. And a lot of people saw them. I'm sure many of these were not flying saucers. Some of them seem to have been maybe. A lot of strange things happening. And then you get the crash in Roswell. 3 hours after the initial press release went out, a retraction was sent out by the military saying, nope, sorry. Just a weather balloon, sorry people. Nothing to see here. That's Harry Truman, of course. Vannevar Bush on the left, the top science advisor to the president. Down on the bottom, you've got Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, surrounded by some other. There's Hoyt Vandenberg back there, and on the right is Omar Bradley. The top Navy guys on the left. Back in those days, people believed in their government. There were no real citizen efforts to break the secrecy. There was no organized movement, but people more or less accepted what we might call the party line, and I won't read this. This is a press release from the Air Force back in the late 40s saying all evidence of these sightings indicate misinterpretations of conventional objects, maybe hysteria or war nerves, again with the war nerves, hoaxers, and crazy people. The Air Force in the 50s, and then Eisenhower repeated this, said there's no such thing as flying saucers except in your imagination, and on and on and on. And this is really what you get to this day, except a little more tactfully. During the 50s, we get the first efforts to challenge the government by citizen groups. We get a big crisis in 1952. UFOs was such a big thing in 1952. People were not just civilians, but military. According to an Air Force officer who was at Wright-Patterson back in those days, he said, if you'd gone to Wright-Pat in 1952 and talked to the people there, you would have thought an invasion was underway. Those are his words. That man in the inset here is the retired major of the Marine Corps, Donald Kehoe. He was a leading figure to end UFO secrecy back then. Started a group called NICAP, which was the main civilian group at that time. And their strategy was very simple. Believers in the American system, the American way, they wanted to work within the system to end the secrecy. So the idea was you go through Congress, have open congressional hearings. That's our system. There are representatives. We're going to have them crack the secrets. Didn't quite work. Typically, there's a number of times, the attempts by NICAP to get the hearings, they'd have a couple of sympathetic congressmen in there who would say, yeah, we're going to do it. And every time at the 11th hour, someone pulled the carpet out from underneath them. The gentleman on your left was Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt, who had, for about a year, run the UFO desk in the Air Force. Wrote a book in 1956 that strongly contradicted the official Air Force statements and said, actually, we investigated a lot of these and they're pretty weird. He didn't quite state that they were extraterrestrial, but he certainly hinted strongly that that was the case. A couple of years later, Ruppelt issued a second edition of the book, completely debunking his first, and then he died a year after that of a heart attack at the age of 37. The man on your right was Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first director of the CIA. Now, if there are any historians of the U.S. intelligence community, my question would be, why has no historian written about Hillenkoetter's obsession with the UFO topic? The man was the first director of the CIA. He was a founding board member of NICAP. For 5 years was an active member of NICAP. Why? Well, that's kind of interesting. You go through the studies in intelligence,